A Year with God, Day 86. Today we start looking at the idea of worship as a spiritual discipline. And their definition of worship is this. It's expressing in words, music, rituals, and silent adoration the greatness, beauty, and goodness of God, by means of which we enter the supernatural reality of the glory of God. I've heard a lot of definitions of worship. From the purely technical definitions of the Hebrew and Greek words used for worship, a lot of attempts at a functional definition of worship. This is one of the more interesting ones I've come across. In my own attempts to define worship, I always seem to run into more questions than answers. I've heard a lot of attempts at coming up with an operational definition of worship. Something that's functional, not that's theological, but something that you can actually use. A lot of the attempts that I have seen to do that always seem to come up a little bit short in some area or another. It seems sometimes that if we try to define worship too much, we end up defining too many things out of it. In the reading today, the commentators said this. In worship we seek to enter God's presence. We can and do worship in many ways. In song and prayer and silence, on our knees, seated at our desks, standing in a forest. And so it seems like they kind of take the same approach, that if we define worship too carefully, we end up defining things out of worship rather than defining things into worship. So this is one of the sections that I am looking forward to, but at the same time, one that, at least here at the beginning, I seem to have a fair amount of trepidation for. Because of some of my own challenges in coming up with a question, answering the question of what is worship, how do we worship? It seems like very often, at least in my tradition, we define worship. Sometimes we define it as a time of singing, and sometimes it seems like we define even the type of music that qualifies as worship. And I struggle sometimes with some of those definitions. I don't think they're broad enough. I think that sometimes when we define it, we define too much out of it, and we end up limiting what worship really is and what worship really should be. On the other hand, if we go with a very broad definition, like kind of like what they have here, or in another place where they say, worship is seeking to enter God's presence, we have such a broad definition that sometimes it becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult to use that definition. So I think those are some of the challenges that we deal with when it comes to looking at the idea of what does it really mean to worship God. The actual text reading for today was a good place to start when you're talking about it. It's John 4:23. But the Father is, or the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is looking for people like that to worship Him. And I just kind of paraphrase that last part of it, which I think emphasizes the priority of worship. But again, to me, this is one of my struggles. If God places such an emphasis on wanting people to worship, wanting people to connect with Him, our definition becomes all the more important. And in some cases, our attempts to define worship can become something that actually limits us from worshiping God. So those are my thoughts here at the beginning of our 20-day trek through worship. The spiritual practice for the next several days is, I'll go ahead and read it to you. It's to integrate worship more fully into your everyday life, such as singing a praise song, remembering to thank God for something, finding a few minutes of a quiet place to sit in quiet adoration, gathering a few friends together for prayer and worship, or praise and worship, even attending a church that might be different from one that you normally do, that uses a different style of worship, a different form of worship. So, for the next several days, I'll try to make it, and I try to make it a point to do some of those things anyway, but for the next several days I'll try to make it even more of a point as we attempt to explore what worship really is.